Hey everybody, Chronos here with another Was on the video. Now, I recently have seen a few Was on the videos and discussions that have the game's flight model as topic, and I figured since it is an often discussed topic, I make a short video about my opinion of the state of simulator battle flight models in War Thunder and the progress of flight models overall in the game. Now, flight models are of course a huge topic with lots of elements to it, and discussing all of them in detail would take hours, especially considering the huge amount of aircrafts in War Thunder, so I will focus primarily on what I consider the basic and most obvious element that makes a plane in War Thunder feel like a plane or not, and that is spins and stalls. Now, I am no flight model expert, so I won't go into too much detail. Now, what I talk about here won't be anything new for many sim pilots, but of course War Thunder Sim Mode is still a game, and no matter what some might try to tell you, a prior knowledge of aircraft, even though it helps, is not necessary to play as long as you are willing to learn. So I thought it might still be interesting to many people to show you a few basics of when I consider a flight model in War Thunder Simulator Battle as pretty good, or when as unfinished or straight up broken. Now, I say basics because when it comes to flight models, there are of course many factors that matter. For example, energy retention or of course engine power. Now, things like engine power, maximum speed and so on are very important, but they are what I call the data part of the flight model. Engine power, for example, will influence speed, acceleration, climb rate and energy management. It's hugely important, but there is one thing it has no real influence over in simulator battle, and that is if the plane more or less behaves and feels like an aircraft or not. A plane that just doesn't behave like an aircraft to begin with won't change that because it gets more accurate engine settings. The other way around, a plane that does behave like an aircraft should, but has too few or too much horsepower, will still behave like an aircraft. A under or overpowered aircraft, as far as horsepower is concerned, but still an aircraft. So for me, the first hurdle is making a plane stall and getting it into a spin, because there are simply no spin-proof World War II fighters. If the plane does not stall or spin when it should, the flight model is broken, and I don't have to even look at anything else. I know the plane does not behave like an aircraft right there. If the plane behaves, however, like expected, then you can go into further details like engine power, energy retention and so on. However, in my experience so far, if the plane's behavior in War Thunder when it comes to stalls and spins is as expected, the rest of the flight model usually, with a few exceptions, performs pretty decent as well. The other way around, if you can't get the plane to spin at all, it in most cases has an overperforming energy retention also. Well, and this basic behavior is what I want to show a little bit in this video. It is well known that the flight models in War Thunder are in varying states of being finished. I personally place the planes in War Thunder roughly within three groups. The pretty good ones, those are those that behave mostly like one would expect. Then the half-finished ones that show some of the expected behavior but not all. And then the last group, those are the flight models that might come in handy if Gaijin should ever decide to include the Silent Radar into the game. Now, let's take a look of what I more or less expect from a plane with a pretty decent flight model and how the other groups often look like in comparison. But first, let's talk quickly about the basics of what happens when a plane stalls and spins. Now, the wing stalls when its angle of attack gets too high. That's the angle of the wing in relation to the airstream. If you increase this angle of attack, the lift of the wing also increases up to a certain point. Now, this point is called critical angle of attack. Above that point, the airflow starts to separate from the top of the wing and the lift decreases fast. The wing is stalled. Now, the stall is defined over the angle of attack. As the plane flies slower though, the airflow over the wing gets slower and they create less lift. So you have to pull the nose up more, increase the angle of attack of the wing to keep your altitude up as you get slower. Now, as you increase your angle of attack to keep your altitude up as your speed decreases, you get closer and eventually reach the critical angle of attack and you will stall. That speed is called the stall speed. I just mentioned that real quick to clear up a misconception that the plane cannot stall above its stall speed. It can stall at any speed as long as you can get the angle of attack of the wing above critical. Though, at higher speed the control stiffening will often prevent you from reaching the necessary angle of attack. Now, if that stall is unsymmetrical, meaning one wing stalls earlier than the other, because you pulled too hard in a turn or simply because of the yaw from the engine torque, you will lose lift faster on one side and the plane will roll violently. And if you don't release pressure on the stick as soon as you notice the stall, you will most likely end up in a spin. So that's some basics about stalls and spins. With this in mind, let's take a look at a few of the planes and how they behave. Starting with what I consider the good planes, and then the half-finished ones and the broken ones, to show you the difference. Before I talk a little bit about the flight model progress in War Thunder in general. Well, the first plane I want to show you is the BF-109 G14, which has a pretty new flight model, one that is considered one of the best in War Thunder currently. Now, I'm not doing any special standardized test set, I just want to show you quickly like I would expect a fighter to more or less handle in a typical situation. Of course, not every fighter is the same and there are differences in how fast it would stall or spin, how it spins and how hard it is to get out of it, but this should serve as a nice example of the basics. So let's just assume we want to turn after an enemy fighter and in our excitement we pull way too hard on the stick while trying to get a shot. So I roll and pull all the way back on my stick to follow my imaginary target, going over the critical angle of attack and going into an asymmetrical stall that rolls my plane around and then into a spin. Now, as you can see, I have my stick neutralized here, and my plane will not magically come out of the spin without me doing something about it. If I don't react, I spin all the way into the ground. So let's do the standard spin recovery, throttle to 0 and full rudder against spin direction. The spin slows down and the nose slowly drops, allowing the plane to speed up again, and it exits the spin and I can pull up again. Now again, with planes being very different, not everyone will or should react exactly like that, but it shows the basics of what I expect from a decent fighter flight model. Now, the BF-109 G14 of course has a pretty high wing loading in comparison to some other fighters. A plane with a lower wing loading will be able to turn tighter at lower speeds, but in the end, even a plane with a very low wing loading will stall if the angle of attack of the wing gets too high. The Spitfire Mark I would be such an example. This low-rank Spitfire has one of the lowest wing loadings for any monoplane fighter in the game. Still, as you can see, if you simply pull all the way back on the stick in a turn, the plane will stall and spin, just like the 109. That was not always the case, by the way. The low-tier Spitfires used to be pretty broken in this regard, but got an update about half a year ago and now behave as one would expect here. Well, so those are two examples for how I would expect a fighter with a decent flight model to act in regards to spins. Thankfully, a larger and larger amount of planes in War Thunder are part of this group. Now, let's talk quickly about the half-finished or half-broken, depending on how you look at it, planes. Now, as I have said, by this I mean planes that show some proper behavior, but not all. That's a big field, of course. That could be, for example, that a plane will spin, but it is far too difficult to get into one, or a plane that will recover immediately by itself, never needing any spin recovery from the pilot. One plane I would put into this group is the Yak-1. Just pulling back on the stick is not enough to get the thing into a spin. Now, if you help a bit with the rudder, you can get it into a spin, one which is pretty hard to recover from, but overall it is just way too hard to get this plane into a spin to begin with. Almost impossible to do by accident, you really have to try to get it into a spin. So that's an example for a plane that I consider to be half-finished or half-broken. And well, that brings me to the last group, which is thankfully by now by far the smallest group. The completely broken ones. Here we talk about planes that are usually almost or completely impossible to spin and, as I said in the beginning, usually have problems with energy retention as well. Those planes simply do not act like aircraft at all. Well, let's take a look at one. And I know there are many people that don't want to hear about it, but probably the most broken fighter in simulator battle is the A6M20 and has been since about 2 years. Some always try to explain the behavior of this plane away by pointing out its light weight, expecting it to have magical properties because of it, and yes, it is light, yes, it has a very low wing loading, about 10% lower than the Mark I Spitfire from earlier, by the way. That gives the plane a great turn rate and good energy retention in turns, but that simply does not mean the plane can break the laws of physics. The Zero is impossible to get into a spin. Full elevator obviously doesn't work, so I try to add full rudder to the mix and full ailerons for good measure after that. Looks funny, but does not get the plane into a spin. After that I tried the same routine with the engine at 0% and the result is the same. If you pull full elevator abruptly in a zero, the plane should easily manage enough of an angle of attack to get above critical angle of attack. It is a real pity that such an iconic fighter like the Zero apparently has such a low priority to fix. As I have said, it behaves like this since about 2 years. Yeah, there were minor changes here and there like control stiffening, but overall the plane is in this state for way too long. Another example of this illustrious group of planes would be the BDD destroyer. Not a fighter actually, but a torpedo and dive bomber, but often used as a fighter by players, and not surprisingly seeing how it quote-unquote flies. The plane with its gull wings looks like something out of a science fiction movie, so I guess it is fitting that it flies like something out of a science fiction movie as well. The flight model of this plane is also about 2 years old. Now, the effect of those forgiving or non-existent stall and spin characteristics on gameplay, other than the obvious fact that the plane in a simulator mode should of course behave like a plane, and if it doesn't it is an issue, is that with the plane not being able to spin, it is of course way easier to turn and maneuver in those planes. It is not like you can make a mistake and spin into the ground, so you can just mindlessly pull the stick all the way back in every situation. But there are of course also maneuvers you cannot do if the plane can't spin. One example would be a snap roll, as shown here in the P40. Now, a snap roll is an easy maneuver in which you press down the rudder and pull the stick back. With the rudder pressed and the plane yawing, when you pull the stick back, one wing will stall much earlier than the other and you can do a very fast and violent roll. Some like to use this as a method to make a plane close behind overshoot, as it slows you down, and some even use it in certain situations to get around the slow roll rate of an aircraft. Now, I have to say I personally am not a very big fan of the snap roll as a combat maneuver, but some people are, and if you like the maneuver or not, it is an ability you should have, a tool to use in the right circumstances. But if your plane will not spin, it won't do a snap roll either. Well, the Zero and the Destroyer were two examples for the Silent Radar flight model group. Thankfully, I would say that by now not more than 10% of the single-engine fighters in the game are part of that group. This group used to be far bigger. And well, that brings me to the other thing I wanted to talk about in this video, and that is the progress of flight models in War Thunder in simulator battle. Now, recently I heard the opinion sometimes that there is no progress with the flight models at all in War Thunder, or that they are getting worse, that they are getting simpler, and that Gaijin tries to remove spinning from the game completely. And that is also a reason why I made this video, because I disagree. I don't think that there is no progress with the flight models. There certainly is, in my opinion. Now, it is not very fast progress, it never has been, it is pretty slow, and as I have mentioned in the past, it is often a bit of a 2-step forward and 1-step back situation. 2 flight models get improved, another one somewhere else gets for some reason worse again. But overall, there is progress, and even with the 2-step forwards and 1-step back thing, you will eventually get there. It will just take you a lot longer than it should. Let's talk about a few examples. One very good one in my opinion is the Spitfire line. A little over half a year ago, the entire Spitfire line in the game, every single one, had an unsatisfactory flight model. The lower rank Spitfires were behaving similar to what was shown here with the Zero. The higher rank ones were a little bit better, but still in the half-broken group. As mentioned before, the lower rank Spitfires were fixed months ago, and I've already showed the Spitfire Mark I, and the higher rank Spitfires got an update just recently in 1.70. With those updates combined, the Spitfire line is now, in my opinion, the one with the overall second best flight models after the BF-109 line. Yes, the engine settings are sometimes unfortunate, with some of the lower rank Spitfires using very late settings and some of the Griffins very early ones, but as far as the behavior of the plane is concerned, they are greatly improved over what they used to be. This LF Mark IX, for example, as you can see, will stall and spin, as one would expect, and it just simply did not do that pre-1.70. On the other hand, planes that don't spin at all usually have very old flight models, like the Zero and the Destroyer. Another example is the Russian tree. When I started making videos for realistic battles with full real controls about 2 years ago, I also wanted to do a video of a Russian fighter, but I couldn't because I could not find one that behaved even close to like it should. Not one. Both the LA5 line as well as the Yak line would not spin at all and behave like the Zero shown in this video here. The Lax 3s on the other hand would enter a spin when you were just thinking about doing a turn and were mostly unflyable. The situation here has been greatly improved. The Lavochkin line has very good flight models from the LX3 to the LA5FN, though not so much after that, and the Yak line also behaves, with a few exceptions like the Yak 1 and the Yak 9D, pretty well. So here I can just not see how the flight models were supposed to be better back in the day, when the entire tree was not able to get into a spin. There are other examples as well. Take the BF109 line, which I now consider to be the best in the game, with only the E and the D behaving a bit weird at the moment. Again, there were times where hardly one of the higher rank BF109s that wasn't the G6 would spin. That was quite a while ago, but still. So I do certainly see progress and improvement, even though it is slow. But of course, on the other hand, it has to be said that there are still quite a few planes that are quite unfinished in War Thunder. Well, one reason is certainly the large amount of planes in the game compared to any other game that would need flight models. And another one is the number of planes that are constantly added to the game. I'm fairly sure if they would not have done that, most of the flight models in-game would be pretty good by now, as the flight model artists could have focused on the existing planes instead of making entirely new ones all the time. However, that is simply something you can't really expect. The simple fact is, the War Thunder community wants more planes. It is the most asked question in every Q&A, when will this plane finally be in the game and when that one. And for a game like War Thunder, the introduction of new content is financially one of the most important things there is. The new content gets them into the news, on websites and on YouTube, it gets new players into the game, and it draws old players back into it to try new stuff out. This is one of the big reasons for World of Tanks' success. Not just that they get new players, but that they manage to keep old ones interested with new tanks and draw those that quit back into the game with it. And that is what made many people play the game not for weeks or months, but years. And a similar thing is true for War Thunder, so while it would be nice from one point of view if they would simply stop new content for a year or so to get all the flight models in the game polished up, it is simply not a realistic thing to expect. Now, the introduction of new planes into the game can also be a reason why some may get the impression that the flight models get simpler. They had that effect on me a few batches ago, because for quite a while it was pretty normal for new planes to be introduced into the game with a very basic flight model. New planes could rarely stall, and a few of them are still in this state. A few examples would be the Ki-27 or the Hayate or the F-7F Tigercat, which to this day has one of the worst flight models in the game. So looking at those planes when they were introduced into the game, one could think, well, those planes are new, so the flight models are new as well, so this might be the direction the game is going. However, by now I think that those flight models were in that state simply because they ran out of time. And in recent batches the quality of new planes was much better. The G14 was one of them, of course, and the FFA line that was introduced in 1.70 is also, while not perfect, in a pretty good state, and magnitudes better than new planes used to be in earlier batches. Now, one thing I sometimes wonder about, and I know I'm not the only one, is sometimes you have situations in War Thunder where one plane has a pretty good flight model, while another similar plane has a really bad one. And in such cases I wonder why it is not possible to just take the working flight model and slightly modify it to use it on the similar plane with the broken flight model. Let's take a look at such an example of that we currently have in War Thunder. Well, here I fly the LA5FN. Now, the plane back in the old days used to be the most broken fighter around, but these days it has a pretty good flight model. As you can see, it spins as one would expect. And it has taken quite a few flight model updates to get this plane from where it used to be to where it is now. The most recent one being just in 1.70, where the plane's engine output got updated and reduced to what it should be. So overall a nice plane, which sadly still has a battle rating that is too low, but flight model wise it performs quite nicely. Now, just after the LA5FN we got the LA7, which is of course a further improvement of the LA5. The plane is still very similar to the LA5FN, it has some aerodynamic improvements and it is a little bit lighter as more parts are made from metal instead of wood, but overall it's still very similar to the LA5FN. Sadly, despite the similarity, the flight model performs completely different. As you're going to see, the behavior is not unlike that of the Yak 1 from earlier. The plane is extremely hard to get into a spin. It has a broken flight model. So with this plane so similar to the LA5FN, which has a very good flight model, why not take it with a slight modification and use it for the LA7 to replace its broken flight model, at least until it is fixed? A question I have asked myself with other planes in the past as well. Surely having a working flight model from a similar plane is better than having a broken flight model that doesn't resemble any aircraft at all. Well, as I have said, I'm no flight model expert, so there might very well be a very good reason for that I just don't know about. However, that is another problem. If Gaijin would be a bit more open with the information about those things, then I would know. That is still my biggest critic point when it comes to War Thunder, and has been since I played the game. I consider myself to be a reasonable person, and I can accept the slow progress and having to deal with some unfinished flight models as long as I see progress. For reasons I have already explained, the large amount of planes in the game, and that flight model programming is not exactly a very common skill set and not just any programmer can do. Though I can understand why others don't have that kind of patience. But the lack of communication and explanation why some of those issues, flight model and otherwise, are in the state they are in, that for me is a much bigger problem. If Gaijin would just talk to us and explain the reasons for some of those issues, I'm sure the acceptance from many of them would be much higher and the attitude within the community towards Gaijin much better. Take Star Citizen for example. Now that game is still in alpha of course, but still it shows one of the most open development I have ever seen. And if there are problems, there is usually quickly a post from a developer explaining what's causing it and what is done to improve it. That does not speed up the process, but the community sees that their worries are taken seriously and that the people developing the game know about the problems and fears of the players. On the other hand, in War Thunder it is very hard or almost impossible to get a statement regarding the problems like flight models or other issues, for example bombers in simulator battle, from the developers, so the community constantly feels ignored. And what does someone who feels he's being ignored? Well, he will usually yell louder to get attention, and if that still doesn't do anything, well, a lot of people will eventually get quite pissed off, and show that in the way they formulate their opinion and feedback. A pity to see that, especially since Gaijin themselves often react quite butthurt about people voicing their opinion in a less than polite way, apparently still not getting that their own lack of communication with the community about problems is a big reason for a lot of the negativity towards them. Well, that's just something I wanted to add in the end. Well, so this was my little flight model overview video, and this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was informative, thanks for watching and maybe I'll see you next time.